Hello, my name is Neil Buttery, food historian and chef, and welcome to the British Food History Podcast. My guests today are archaeologists Chris Wakefield and Rachel Ballentyne, both from the Cambridge Archaeological Unit of Cambridge University. And they are here to tell me about an absolutely amazing site found close to Peterborough that tells us a huge amount about daily life in a late Bronze Age settlement. Prepare to have your minds blown, folks. Now I shall let you know about my news at the end of the episode as per, but I'm going to give a headline, and that is that Thomas Dinas of the Delicious Legacy podcast, fantastic podcast, is now helping me with the sound engineering, mixing and editing. Now I should have mentioned this last week actually, but I forgot. Thomas has recently interviewed last week's guest, Jenny Linford, about her other recent book, Repast, the book we didn't talk about last time. So do have a listen to that episode of The Delicious Legacy. Now, I'm able to hire Thomas to do this because of all of you who have either donated a one-off virtual coffee or pint, or started up a monthly £3 subscription. So thank you all who have done that. You're making a real difference to the podcast. If you're interested in becoming a subscriber or donator, go to britishfoodhistory.com and click on the Support the Blog and Podcast tab. Subscribers get access to the Secret Podcast, my Easter eggs page, bonus blog posts, and a monthly newsletter, plus first dibs on any special events. There are all sorts of other ways to support, of course, that don't cost a penny, like leaving a rating and review on your favourite podcast app, or a like on the YouTube channel. And also tell your friends, post on social media, spam your enemies, let everybody know. Season 9 of the podcast is sponsored by Fruit Pig, Britain's last remaining commercial craft producer of fresh blood black puddings. Fruit Pig, also known as Matthew Cockin and Grant Harper, put a huge amount of care and attention into harvesting fresh blood to create a proper, traditional, unique, and most importantly, a very delicious black pudding. Also available are their gluten-free black puddings, their rather decadent hog's pudding, and their traditional haggis. They also make their own bacon and sell some excellent British charcuterie. Visit fruitpig.co.uk for more details of their products and their journey. You can also find your local stockists and get access to their shop. Grant and Matthew have very kindly given listeners to the British Food History Podcast a unique special offer, 10% off your order until the end of October 2025. Use their offer code FOODHIS, FOODHIS, all one word, capital F, please. Use that code in the checkout. If you can, please do support them. Right, let's get cracking. I am talking about the Must Farm project with archaeologist Chris Wakefield, who led the dig, and environmental archaeologist Rachel Ballentyne, who focused upon the scientific analysis of this outstanding late Bronze Age settlement, which has been dubbed Britain's Pompeii, for reasons which will soon become clear. We talk about the unique circumstances of how and why the site is so well preserved, kitchen clutter, animal husbandry, querns, frumenty, pike sushi, and whether the English's love of mustard goes back 3 millennia, amongst many other things. Those listening to the Secret podcast right now, you're getting 20 minutes of bonus material that includes the importance of foraging, the evidence for fermentation, and I know many of you are very interested in this subject, but also Bronze Age recipes, and the uses of the whole cereal plant, plus much more. So please enjoy Bronze Age Food and Foodways with Chris Wakefield and Rachel Ballentyne. Hello, welcome to the podcast, Chris Wakefield and Rachel Ballentyne.
Hi there.
Thank you very much.
Now, before we get started looking at Bronze Age food and foodways, could you tell listeners a little bit about yourselves and the Must Farm project? How did it come about? What were your roles? Chris?
I'm Chris Wakefield. So I'm an archaeologist that works for the Cambridge Archaeological Unit, which is part of the Department of Archaeology here at the University of Cambridge. And I've always wanted to be an archaeologist. It's something I've always really enjoyed. And having the privilege to work on the Mus Farm project was probably going to be the highlight of my entire career. So I feel like I've peaked quite early in some ways.
It's all downhill from now, is it?
Yeah, pretty much, I think. The background to the project itself is that it's what we call a development-led project, which is actually what 90% of archaeological excavations in the UK are like. So these are projects sort of involving any kind of planning conditions or development that happens. So it could be a housing estate being built, a road or an infrastructure project, or in the case of Mus Farm, a quarry site, which is extracting lots of clay to make bricks. And as part of the kind of work that goes on there to assess whether there's any archaeology, this led to the discovery of pretty much one of the most exciting prehistoric finds, certainly in Northwest Europe within recent memory. And we kind of went in as part of that to really investigate what the archaeology was and to record and remove that as part of that process, which led me to being able to work with Rachel.
Hello.
Hi.
I am an environmental archaeologist, which means I spent a childhood wandering around outdoors looking at all sorts of bugs and beasties and plants, and then trying to make sense of it in terms of human lives and humanity and how people lived and subsisted in the past. So I'm fascinated by living environments, but also food and farming and survival on a very long-term perspective. And my role in this project was to visit the excavations episodically and think about all the different scientific techniques that could contribute to what was happening in the field. So all the different samples we could collect, all the different ways that we could engage with the wider scientific community and really bring the story of these people's lives to life for us in today, based on tiny bits and pieces of plants and animals locked up in the ground.
What is amazing, because often you see, I don't know, archaeology shows on TV and things like that, and you see the experts coming in and they've got some tiny thing, microscopic thing, and you think, how have you extrapolated all this huge picture that you've managed to conjure? But even me, with my very untrained eye, when I was reading through the Mus Farm stuff, I just couldn't believe what I was seeing. It was like, obviously, with your amazing ability to use these techniques and analyses and things like that, helps to give this rounded picture. But some of the things that were just there when you were excavating, you must have just been thinking, I just can't believe what I'm seeing here. Because it doesn't require any imagination to see what the people were doing. It's just right there in front of you. Requires no interpretation for quite a lot of it, it seems.
Yeah, so I think it's probably a good point to kind of describe what Mus Farm actually is.
Yes.
So we were incredibly fortunate to effectively be faced with a surviving kind of homestead from a group of people that were living during the Bronze Age. So when we kind of talk about the Bronze Age in the UK at this particular time, we're looking at a period that's 2300 to around 800 BC. And that's broken down into various different kind of an earlier, middle and a late. So Mus Farm itself belongs to the very end of the Bronze Age, around 850 BC. And we're in the Fens, we're in the east of England. So Mus Farm itself is located in Whittlesea, which is just outside of Peterborough in the east of England. And this is an environment which I'm sure Rachel is going to go into a lot of detail about, which is, extraordinary landscape and environment to be looking at. It's kind of quite an interesting environment in that it's very wet. So we have lots of these kind of old river channels dotted around that landscape. And the story of kind of Mus Farm is really tied to one of these old river channels, which we give a fancy name of a paleo channel to. And this series of houses that people would have been living in were built on stilts directly above one of these rivers. And they would have had a big fence around the outside of that we call a palisade. And we have the construction of that site, we have the people living there, and then we have the end of that site's life all kind of captured and preserved in a single location. And what's extraordinary is around 9 to 12 months after that site was built, the entire thing burnt down in an enormous fire, and that kind of created an incredible set of preservation conditions with that charring and then the waterlogging, basically preserving things we would never normally expect to see in the archaeological record. So what we were looking at as archaeologists is, it felt as we were digging this like we were going round to a neighbour's house, because the detail was really there. However, these neighbours just happened to live almost 3,000 years ago. Rachel, it was so incredible, wasn't it, to see that site and to be excavating on it. It was just extraordinary, the details that were coming out.
Yeah, it was breathtaking. There were moments even quite early on in the excavation when We didn't know what was going to be down there when we started excavating, but when the circular fan of rafters just started to appear out of the silts, we had a bit of a, "Oh, are you seeing what I'm seeing?" moment. And then as we went down and the rafters began to be excavated away and we could see all these possessions lying underneath and the remains of the refuse around the edges of the buildings as well. It really was routinely both daunting and spine-tingling, like emotions that you don't routinely feel, I would say, on an archaeological excavation. So to experience that wow moment on a daily, weekly basis was quite overwhelming, actually.
Archaeology isn't necessarily about finding the artifacts, which a lot of people watching sort of Time Team and Digging for Britain might sometimes think. It's actually about how can we learn about what the people's lives would have been like. So this was an almost unparalleled opportunity to see what it would have been like to be living in this environment in 850.
When it comes to historians, throughout looking at studying a different historical period, people don't really look at the food, which is very frustrating for me, who is interested in food. How well studied is food consumption, acquisition, just general farming? How much do you know from this period? That's a bit of a big question, isn't it? But what do we know about the basic sort of setups of these little, could you call them hamlets or villages in Bronze Age England?
We actually know quite a lot. There's been really dedicated scientific research into subsistence in its broadest sense in prehistory for about, like, we've been studying this for about 40 to 50 years now. And there are a whole series of different disciplines that target, for example, the animal bones and the way they are butchered and the species that are represented. And there are other groups of people called archaeobotanists who sieve tons and tons of soil and look for tiny fragments of charred plant remains, which are the vestiges of the crops that were being brought to the settlement and processed and consumed. But the challenge we have as archaeologists is that we're quite good at seeing what is happening out in the fields in terms of species and agricultural practice, because we have the tools and we have these fragmentary remains that include weed seeds that tell us about how the crops were growing, for example. And we're quite good at seeing the end product in terms of refuse and poo. Mm-hmm. So we can see where it all ends up and we can see where it's all come from. But there's this mysterious, transient, beautiful bit in the middle where people are selecting ingredients, combining them, creating recipes, creating meals, sharing those meals with each other. And that is very rarely captured. I think the example of Pompeii is probably the one that speaks most widely to people because of that capacity of a sudden event to capture a moment and lots of objects and activities which normally we see at one end or the other but not in the middle.
Yes, the opportunity to observe the minutiae of, I don't know, some normal afternoon in someone's life. I guess for some people might think that's not very interesting, but I find it absolutely fascinating. You're basically getting the chance to have a nosy around their house.
Yeah, and I think what fascinates me a little bit about that is that people often come with kind of preconceptions about prehistory that, the colour palette is very brown, it's very beige, and that people were effectively almost struggling to survive. It's this kind of period where most people don't really think that they were similar to the people that we are today, whereas sites like this are really fascinating in terms of the comparisons that we can make. So we know that at these houses they were stacking their bowls together to save space in their kitchens. We know that they had a wide variety of different pots pretty much for every occasion, from tiny little couple of centimetre high cups all the way up to enormous 20 odd litre storage vessels. So it's giving us that real insight into what it would be like to kind of walk around and look at one of these houses. And actually they're quite cluttered, they're quite lived in, they feel really kind of relatable to today.
No, absolutely. And I'm guessing, talking about the stuff that maybe you didn't necessarily directly see, that of the world of agriculture. You found some sickles and things. You also found information, I suppose, about the network of people, or the way the people were travelling around in their environment, because you mentioned butchering of animal bones there, of animal carcasses. It looked like there wasn't any large-scale butchering of whole carcasses going on. That was being done somewhere else. these little hints at the food and the foodways where the food was travelling and where people were travelling to it was just all so fascinating.
Yes, so there were things like the heads and the hooves and the spines of a lot of the carcasses were missing, and those are elements that tend to be removed quite early in the butchery process. And a lot of what we saw on the settlement were the meat-bearing parts, so mid to upper limbs in particular. And there are also things like particular plant species which we know could not have been growing locally, like lime trees that were being used for particular fibres. And also the cereal crops themselves must be growing on slightly drier land in the area, not in the middle of the fen. So there's a sense of mobility coming through in lots of the very early stages of the analysis that we were doing.
And I'm assuming evidence of quite a high degree of skill and knowledge from these people. Again, people, like you were saying, Chris, before, people are, it's drudgery. Everyone's, like, I don't know, dragging people around with stone clubs. You get this sort of cartoon, or many people maybe have this cartoon of people from prehistory in their head, when really these are really highly skilled people. Well, people are people. It's in our nature, isn't it, to push technology. As soon as we discover a new technology, push it to its extreme, so then it pushes us on. And people in the Bronze Age are no different to people now. They're really knowledgeable, really skillful, and they're always looking to develop and improve on what they're doing already.
Yeah, very much so. I mean, I think that it's such a great point that they were based in this particular site, but they're really using the whole of that landscape around them for a wide range of different activities. So whether it's grazing different animals, whether it's hunting in different areas, whether it's foraging or kind of engaging with their crops. So it's this sense that they're, again, very knowledgeable about the immediate environment that they're living in. What springs to mind a little bit, Rachel, is we've been chatting about this before, about some of the kind of cereal crops, for example, about how the preservation there is so good. We can actually see some of the insight into how they were kind of harvesting that. I don't know if you want to have a bit of a chat about that.
Sure. Normally, when we find charred remains of cereals, we can see the grain and we can see what we call the chaff, the papery parts that grow around the grain. And there are clever ways of quantifying those and comparing them to work out what stage of the processing from the field to food that you're seeing, with the less and less chaff is present through that process. But what we had at Moss Farm was the stored crops, which were part processed, so they were still slightly chaffy, but some of them were still so complete that we could see the whole ear. It was still sat intact in the ground. So not only has it survived the journey from the field to the settlement, it survived intact as an ear during storage, and then during the fire and the collapse into the ground, the 3,000 years until now, and us excavating it, which is an incredible journey for one cereal ear. And when we looked at these charred ears, the very base of them showed a sort of pinch point. We could see that rather than being harvested in a sort of broad sweep of a sickle at ground height, these are being plucked in the way that today we pluck blackcurrants or other sort of hedgerow fruits and things. It's very precise. It's very targeted to the ripest ears that are worth plucking in that moment. And it probably represents multiple journeys into the fields, which are going to be very genetically diverse and ripen in a very ununiform way. So there'll be all different sorts of heights in the field, and the ears will be ripening at different moments. So the choreography, the tempo of harvesting, and the sort of really quite labour-intensive fine-grain engagement with those crops is profoundly different, I think, to the sort of surplus orientated, large scale, genetically narrow crops that we have today that are designed to be harvested very quickly in one moment with the machine. It's a completely different world.
I suppose really the absolute choicest thing that you found there, the choicest morsel when it comes to the archaeology, was that pot with spoon. Absolutely amazing.
Pot 44 was this beautiful little vessel that still had its kind of charred contents inside it, and the little sort of wooden spoon or spatula still sticking up out of it. There were 128 different pots that were recovered from the excavation. 64 of those would have still been kind of inside and in use. The others were broken, so exactly half of them. And because of that fire, anything that did sort of have those food remains inside, we have effectively the contents of these meals or foodstuffs that have kind of been prepared in there, which, I mean, it was a bit of a field day for you, I think, really, wasn't it, Rachel? Just this incredible body of evidence to dig into.
Yes, it's also a fabulous challenge because what we have are stunningly charred remains of these agglomerations of stodgy, stewy food, but subsumed within very, what I would call microfossil. Like there's lots of tiny bits of other plants and invertebrates in the river silts, and they have sort of work their way into the remains of the charred food and trying to disentangle what is intrinsic to the pot and what is just the result of sitting in this grungy, rich silt for 3,000 years. It's just the most incredible jigsaw puzzle to disentangle. But what we could see with the charred things that we were more confident were the original contents was really sort of big bubbles and swept patterns that represent a really quite viscous, glutinous entity originally. And that is one of the things where we could see these tiny wheat meal fragments. So it's not a flour-based entity, it's granular. And then we were able to add in contributions from our colleagues, particularly at the University of York, who were able to look at things called lipids, which are fats bound up in the food that have worked their way into the ceramic, the wall of the pot. And so they were able to tell us about some of the things we couldn't see microscopically, but could be seen chemically in the pottery that it sat within.
Are the lipids important because they don't dissolve in water, so they don't get washed away? Is that why they're the things people are focusing on?
They're insoluble and they're also chemically incredibly durable, particularly when it's called adsorption. They actually lock chemically onto the clay particles in the pot. So you have to imagine that the pot is it's a chemical equivalent of Velcro. It's hooking these fatty molecules out of the food and binding them, like locking them into the fabric of the pot itself, which archaeologically is the most incredible resource for us. And it turned out that the very wet sediments at Muss Farm also were chemically exactly the right environment for preserving those chemicals.
That's amazing. And you spotted traces or maybe more than traces of beeswax in there too. So people were actively hunting out honey.
Yes, so we want to infer that it's probably honey. We can't see the honey itself chemically because that's a sugar that's very chemically unstable and doesn't preserve. But we can see the beeswax because it's so lipid rich. And so we do know that people were seeking out honeybees in the wider environment. And it's hard to imagine that they were only going for the beeswax. It's almost, I mean, it's very, very likely that we're picking up on a signature that shows us the honey indirectly. And we also had lots of strong lipid signatures, for example, in that pot for what we call ruminant fats, which is the group that has deer, sheep, cattle in it. And they have a particular type of metabolism that we can't distinguish by species at this sort of fatty molecule level, but we can see them as a group. And this combination of beeswax and ruminant fat as a group seemed to occur and reoccur across pot assemblage. So not just in this one pot 44, which looks like a wonderful sort of grainy, stewy mixture of animal meat and fat and grain and honey, but also in other pots that didn't have the food contents preserved.
Yeah, and you mentioned frumenty as well. That's possibly what we're cooking up. So I had my ears pricked up at frumenty.
Yes. I mean, one of the challenges was when we first saw this assemblage, it's easy to think that you've just walked into somebody's kitchen and you've caught them in the act of cooking. And as we went through analysing this assemblage and thinking about what we were really seeing and the position of storage in these processes, we realised that we weren't walking straight into someone's kitchen when they were in the act of cooking. What we were seeing were ingredients, granary stores, and also leftovers. Food products where there's compartmentalisation of the effort and the time used to prepare the ingredients, the effort and the time used to prepare the food. If you think about the fact they haven't got gas or electricity, cooking something, heating it in itself it's a huge investment in fuel, in effort. You've got all the smoke in the dwelling. So what we see is that there are these intermediate stages where the grain has been perhaps soaked, part prepared, but then stored in that state of what I would call wobble. And whether it's porridge that's been cooked and then stored, for which there are really good ethno-historic examples from Scotland, or whether it's something like frumenty, which is the sort of, I think a lot of the documentary records are quite high status and medieval, which is why they've survived and we know about them. But there are other ethno-historical examples from right across Europe of these sort of part processed grain products that can actually sit around for a few days and just take the pressure off if you're also needing to go out and hunt or gather crops. Or there's 1,001 things they need to do every day in order to survive and subsist and thrive. And food and cooking is one part of that daily set of choices, but they're trying to make it as efficient and manageable as possible. And it's really fun just sort of mixing up some of the sort of quite rigid categories I think we have today about how you prepare and consume grain-based foods, and yeah, try and see some of these intermediate stages a bit more clearly.
Sorry, Chris, do you want to add anything to that? Sorry.
I was just going to ask you, Neil, actually, if did it sound pretty appetizing to you? You're going to be sort of rustling up some sort of honey-basted venison or a kind of nice meaty porridge?
Well, I have made that frumenty from Form of Curie, what's quoted in the research as it happens. I didn't serve it with venison. I served it with hogget instead, because that's what I had available at the time. Very nice. Quite a lot of saffron, which... But one thing that I certainly do know is that frumenty was, as a foodstuff, it's a wheat porridge, I suppose, really. But it was one of those great levelers by the time you do get to the Middle Ages. You know, everybody's eating frumenty. Now, what extra things you're adding to your frumenty is going to depend on your... very much in your social status, but it was a universally recognised foodstuff where I guess it was important in the Middle Ages from the point of view of food identity. So it's no surprise that there's similar stuff going on a couple of thousand years before that. It seems like a natural progression. But of course, it's so easy to make assumptions. Oh, they must have done this, they must have done that. And for the first time, you've got so many pieces of evidence where you've got some direct evidence for what people are actually doing. It's absolutely astounding. It really is.
It's really interesting you mentioned that. People often have these kind of preconceptions about what people would have been doing and assumptions. But it's quite nice at Musfarm. Sometimes the evidence kind of might push back a little bit against that. So if we look at some of the kind of animals that are being consumed as well there's a few kind of surprises in there, particularly regarding the fish that are being captured and eaten at the site.
Yes. Yeah, I was surprised at that people were eating a lot of pike. Wasn't the species I would have guessed.
Yes, about a third of the assemblage of fish bone that we recovered was pike, and some of them were really quite big as well. So a lot of the estimated sizes, like you can work back from the vertebrae and the jawbone lengths, and we have general estimated sizes, like often between 70 to 100 centimetres in length, nose to tail, but there are some individuals in the assemblage that are well over a metre in length. And if you think about the experience of catching a large, very large, aggressive fish, it's not something that you just pop out the river and into a pot.
It's not like tickling
it's a proper
trout.
fight there. Yeah.
They are nice though, pike. Really super firm, meaty flesh. I mean, they are delicious. So I can't blame them for wanting to hunt them out.
One of the things that makes us wonder quite what they're doing with the pike, though, is whether they're even bothering to cook it, or if it's some sort of pike sushi that's going on, or smoked pike, or
Hmm.
they have quite a lot of fish parasites in their poo.
In their
Suggests
coprolites.
it's not been heavily stewed in a pot in the way that you might think. Yeah.
I see. You found several different parasites, in fact, that didn't you? It's indicative of the fact that certainly pork or wild boar was being pretty
Yes.
regularly.
I mean, I
Yes.
don't like to interrupt, but this is probably a good point to forewarn listeners if they're in the middle of, tucking into some sushi or, some nice food that, this next section might be one to tune back in on when you've finished.
Okay.
Do you want to kind of go into a few more details about some of those? They're some pretty interesting results.
Right.
Yes.
We'll strap in.
Okay, so archaeologists in wet places are able to reconstruct parasites from human and other mammal guts where we have the poo preserved, because part of these parasites' life cycle is to generate really, really tough eggs and cysts that persist in the ground until they work their way around and get ingested by something else and the life cycle starts again. And so when we found remains of human poo or coprolites in a monster settlement, we had colleagues at the University of Cambridge who were able to have a look under a very high power microscope and search for these remains of eggs and cysts. And the species they found included things like pig tapeworm, which is still very prolific in the world today, as unfortunately some of your listeners may know. The other surprise, though, was that there was good representation of fish tapeworm and also some really slightly exotic sounding things like the giant kidney worm. A beastie that can grow to up to 1 metre in length and causes great pain and discomfort about your abdomen.
I can't imagine it. Well, I probably can't imagine by the sounds of it.
Dear. But what we're seeing are the side effects of a lifestyle that includes resources gathered from the wetlands themselves, as well as these crops and livestock that are being farmed on the slightly drier ground. You can see it all sort of coming together in terms of the human ecology.
And there were dog coprolites too.
There were, and so we were able to see what the dogs were hoovering up, which looks like bits and pieces of refuse, as you'd expect from the human diets. There was a lot of similarity between the two groups, actually. And also we found like there were quite a lot of gnawed bones recovered from the settlement too. So you could see that dogs were sort of rootling around and doing their things. But actually one of the surprises was that we also had charred remains of sheep dung inside the houses, so we could see that lambs, and in fact there were some lamb skeletons within the houses. Like that some of the livestock is coming right within the home, particularly at the point when the animals are very, very young. But we could see the foddering, like people were not just feeding themselves, they had ideas about what the animals should eat, and they were gathering hay fodder from out in the drier areas of the landscape again and bringing it back to the settlement to feed to the lambs and the nursing ewes within the home.
It was one of those things where you really were plunged into what it must have been like when that fire sprang up, knowing that there was that dozen or so little lambs that just obviously just had to be left behind, because I'm sure if they could, they would have grabbed them. But obviously they just had to make a dash for it. It just made you realise how much care and attention people are taking with their animals, well, and their plants as well, of course.
Yeah, there's a strong sense of nurturing as well as all these strategic decisions that have been made, and the sort of completeness of the domestic environment, that you could be storing things, sleeping, cooking your food, preparing textiles, and having the next generation of your livestock growing up next to you within that home. Whenever I visit reconstructed roundhouses now, I find them incredibly sort of bare and sanitized, and I think sometimes implicitly reflecting attitudes we have today to how space should be that are actually contradicted quite strongly by some of the evidence that we had in abundance within the Moss farmhouses. So I sort of want to go in and start putting animals in them and making them cluttered and messy and very smoky as well. That's something I wanted to mention. I think the grain would have tasted smoky because it was stored up in the rafters, and they've got that lovely, thick, heavy thatch roof with turf in places as well. And the smoke is just going to be coming up and flavouring the grain very slightly.
I think that's a really good point to pick up on, actually, is this is a really rare opportunity to actually kind of explore potentially some of the flavours and some of the decisions that people were kind of making in terms of their food. It's very easy for us to look back and think that people would have potentially just cooked what they needed to survive. It's more about the nutritional content of that rather than actually trying to enjoy food or alter it. But Rachel, you've got some amazing evidence, haven't you, of kind of condiments, I guess?
Yes, I mean, we toned it down quite a bit in the book because it's the point at which the science and the data starts to step towards conjecture. And, well, I mean, it's fun, but as a scientist, you sort of feel like you have to be careful what you put out into the world and let other people perhaps have some of the fun themselves in what it might all mean. But we did have a lot of black mustard seed turn up, and although that's a plant that does thrive on disturbed ground and can be an arable weed, it's consistently there in noticeable amounts. That doesn't sound very statistical, but it's there and it's routinely there. And obviously it's a fabulous condiment that's still super popular today.
It's England's ketchup. I mean, they had it with everything. Again, going back to the Middle Ages, you get visiting dignitaries from around Europe, and they'd be sitting down to another meal with mustard again. They were absolutely sick of the stuff. Anybody coming to visit. So it might be a bit far-fetched saying that love of mustard goes back to before the Roman occupation. Might be pushing it, but
We're pretty confident it does, because the Cambridge Archaeological Unit has also had fabulous finds of charred mustard seed in quantity of thousands on other excavations. And indeed, there are other archaeological units in the country that are encountering similar things in the last sort of 10 years. So this is a story that's coming together. But so at Must Farm, it's not in massive quantities, but it is there. And when we start to look at the bigger picture, it's definitely a plant that is known, and in places at least being handled in a way that uses it as a resource. It's not just always accidental.
And there is so much information out there. We should mention to people, actually, it's all free to read online, download online. I've spent the last couple of weeks reading through it all. Absolutely. It's just amazing. The amount of detail, the number of techniques. And of course, I was focusing on just the food bits, really, and the background about the site. So never mind all the other stuff. It's just absolutely amazing stuff. So what's coming up next for Must Farm and for you too? Is it basically a site that you're going to be working on for the foreseeable next 5, 10, 15 years, or what do you reckon?
It's worth saying that the main part of the project is finished. The excavation at the pile dwelling settlement that we've been talking about is done and completed, and that was possible thanks to funding from Historic England and the site's owner Forterra. So all of that material now is belonging to Peterborough Museum, where hopefully it will be displayed and continue to be exhibited in the future. Hopefully there's going to be the opportunity for further scientific analysis of that material kind of going forward.
And could I ask where people can go to find out this information?
We have a website on Must Farm's Archaeology with details of the publications on there. So there are 2 volumes. The first one is kind of what I would say is more of a general introduction to the site and an overview. And if you're really keen on, again, particularly some of the food evidence, there's a second volume which has a lot of the really kind of detailed scientific papers in there if you want to kind of pursue that further. And again, all open access and free to read online.
It's been so interesting. Thank you very much for sparing the time to come on. It's been great.
Yeah, I think, we're archaeologists, so I mean, any opportunity we get to talk about our research is considered to be, something to be honest, I'm surprised you've got away with a recording as short as this, really.
Thank you very much, Chris and Rachel. If you go to the show notes, you will find links to the Must Farm website, where you can also find information about those papers Chris mentioned, which are an excellent read. I've also included links to the Cambridge Archaeological Unit's social media handles on Instagram and Facebook. Please visit the blog, where you will find an accompanying blog post so you can see some of the artefacts on there for yourselves. Likewise, on the YouTube channel, I will make sure pictures of the artefacts pop up as we mention them. There's a link to my frumenty recipe on the blog. That's a subscriber-only post, though. But let's talk a bit of news. There's not that much news this week. What I'd like to do is thank everyone again for listening and passing on the good word of the pod, because we have breached the top 20 Apple food podcasts. We got a high of 16 after just 2 episodes. So remember, keep on telling people, carry on rating and reviewing. Can a podcast as niche as this go top 10? Well, you never know. If you've got any comments, questions or queries regarding this or any other episode so far, please contact me or leave a message on social media. Do you want to know more about food in this period in time? Do you know of any interesting archaeology going on in Britain that is to do with food and agriculture? Well, I want to know. Remember, there's going to be a postbag episode at the end of the season. So contact me. You can email me, neil@britishfoodhistory.com, or you can find me on social media. I'm on X and BlueSky @NeilButtery, or Instagram and Threads as Dr. that's Dr_Neil_Buttery. I remember episodes are now on YouTube, so you can leave comments there, or at the British Food History Facebook discussion page, which is at facebook.com/groups/British Food History, or on the Spotify app. But until next time, everybody, look after yourselves, please. Cheerio.